From the earliest ages of human interaction, long before nations imagined the shape of their modern borders, and long before global commerce became the humming, interconnected artery system that carries the lifeblood of economies today, trade was already a source of power, competition, suspicion, and occasionally devastating conflict. To understand how previous global trade wars played out, one must travel across centuries of ambition, protectionism, rivalry, and retaliation, watching patterns repeat themselves with a haunting familiarity. The world often imagines trade wars as a distinctly modern phenomenon, born from currencies, stock markets, and industrial output, but their roots are far older, stretching back to when spices could tilt the balance of empires and when access to a port could determine the rise or collapse of civilization. Trade wars tend to begin with the same spark: fear. Fear of being outcompeted, fear of losing jobs, fear of shifting power balances, fear that another nation's rise equals one's own decline. They are rarely born out of malice, but instead from a deep-seated impulse every nation carries: the impulse to protect its industries and safeguard its future. But history reveals, again and again, that when nations escalate economic barriers in the name of self-preservation, they often stumble into cycles of retaliation that produce consequences no one intended. And so, the story of global trade wars is not simply a chronicle of tariffs and embargoes. It is a story of ambition clashing with anxiety, innovation colliding with nationalism, and the painful lessons learned when the world discovers that economic conflict, once unleashed, rarely stays within the boundaries where it was intended. One of the earliest examples of proto-trade war unfolded in the Mediterranean world, during a period when the ancient Greek city-states and rising naval powers competed bitterly for access to grain routes and profitable trading lanes. Athens, with its formidable navy and aspirations of maritime dominance, imposed protective measures and aggressive controls over the grain trade coming out of the Black Sea region. These measures were not tariffs in the modern sense, but they functioned similarly. They restricted rivals' access, reshaped the cost of commodities, and forced smaller states into economic dependency. Sparta and other Greek city-states, feeling suffocated by Athenian leverage, responded with countermeasures, alliances, and eventually military confrontation. The Peloponnesian War, while not remembered as a trade war, was undeniably fueled by the economic dominance Athens tried to exert and the escalating resistance that dominance triggered. It was an early lesson. When economic leverage becomes a tool of power, retaliation is never far behind. Centuries later, the medieval world saw the rise of the Hanseatic League, a powerful coalition of northern European merchant cities that created monopolistic controls over trade from the Baltic region. Their influence was staggering. They controlled routes, set prices, restricted access, and used economic pressure to force compliance on non-member states. When the Kingdom of Denmark attempted to break the League dominance by imposing its own tolls through the Øresund Straits, a fierce trade conflict erupted. It included blockades, embargoes, and political manipulation that lasted for decades. This conflict didn't escalate into a massive military war, but showcased a recurring historical truth. The moment one power tries to corner a market, another power rises to challenge it, and trade becomes a battleground where nations wield economic tools with the same intensity they once wielded swords. But perhaps the most infamous pre-industrial trade war was the series of navigation acts in the 17th century, enacted by England to cripple Dutch shipping and secure English dominance over the Atlantic trade routes. These laws restricted foreign ships from transporting goods into English ports, effectively strangling the Dutch economy, which relied heavily on maritime trade. The Dutch, in turn, responded with their own economic and military measures, leading to several Anglo-Dutch wars. These conflicts were not only fought with cannons at sea, but also with tariffs, embargoes, and competitive legislation designed to weaken the other's economy. It was a vivid reminder that global trade wars, when intensified, often spill over into military confrontation, not because nations seek war, but because economic survival becomes indistinguishable from national survival. The age of exploration and colonial expansion transformed trade wars into something far larger. Suddenly, it wasn't just nations competing, it was empires. The struggle for control over spices, gold, silver, tea, and textiles triggered some of the most consequential economic conflicts in history. The rivalry between Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, France, and England created a chain reaction of trade restrictions, monopolies, and commercial warfare. The Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company acted not only as economic entities, but as military powers, enforcing monopolies with private armies and naval fleets. The spice trade wars, fought across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, resulted from European attempts to dominate trade routes and exclude rivals through tariffs, forced treaties, and outright economic coercion. These confrontations changed the world map, toppled indigenous states, and created economic legacies that still echo today. But no trade conflict in the pre-modern era was as transformative as the one triggered by British mercantilist policies in North America. The colonies, producing raw materials and consuming British manufactured goods, were locked into a system that served the Crown's commercial interests. High taxes, restrictive trade laws, and import controls suffocated colonial merchants. What began as an economic grievance escalated into political mobilization, leading ultimately to the American Revolution. The Boston Tea Party itself was an act of economic rebellion, a response to artificial monopolies and taxation policies imposed for trade advantage. Here, again, history demonstrated that economic pressure, when applied too aggressively, can ignite political revolution. Moving into the industrial age, trade wars became more recognizable in their modern form. As the 19th century progressed, nations adopted tariffs not only to protect domestic industries, but also as tools of national development. The United States, Germany, and many other rising industrial powers used protective tariffs to shield their young manufacturing sectors from British competition. While these policies helped these nations industrialize, they also contributed to tensions that would later reshape the global landscape. One of the most significant examples was the German-American tariff rivalry in the late 1800s, which contributed to international economic fragmentation and set the stage for the geopolitical rivalries that eventually exploded into World War I. The period after World War I provides a stark and painful lesson about the consequences of trade wars in a globalized world. In 1930, as the world grappled with the early stages of the Great Depression, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, imposing some of the highest import taxes in its history. The intention was to protect American farmers and workers, but the effect was catastrophic. Countries around the world retaliated, imposing their own tariffs, collapsing global trade by more than half, and worsening the economic crisis. What began as a defensive policy spiraled into a worldwide trade war that deepened unemployment, bank failures, and economic despair. Economists today widely agree that these protectionist actions significantly prolonged and intensified the Great Depression. It remains one of the clearest warnings in history of how a trade war, born from fear and political pressure, can devastate the global economy when retaliation becomes universal. Following World War II, world leaders sought to prevent such catastrophes from ever happening again. The creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and later the World Trade Organization, WTO, was an attempt to build a rules-based global trading system where disputes could be resolved diplomatically rather than through retaliation. For several decades, these institutions succeeded in reducing large-scale trade conflicts. But even within this period of relative stability, tensions lingered beneath the surface. Japan's rapid industrial growth during the 1960s through the 1980s triggered a wave of trade frictions with the United States, particularly in the automotive and electronic sectors. Tariffs, voluntary export restraints, and retaliatory legislation became part of a long-running economic rivalry. Though this did not escalate into a full trade war, it emphasized a recurring pattern. When one nation rises quickly in industrial power, established powers react defensively. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, global trade wars began taking new forms. No longer fought solely with tariffs, but also through technological restrictions, currency interventions, subsidies, and intellectual property battles. The United States and the European Union engaged in multiple disputes over aircraft manufacturing subsidies, leading to one of the longest and most complex cases in the history of the WTO. China's rise as a global manufacturing powerhouse further intensified tensions. As China integrated into the world economy, it became both a critical trade partner and a strategic competitor to many nations. Allegations of currency manipulation, forced technology transfer, state subsidies, and industrial espionage sparked a series of trade disputes that reached their peak in the late 2010s with comprehensive tariffs imposed between the US and China. This conflict became the most significant trade war of the modern era, affecting hundreds of billions of dollars in goods, disrupting global supply chains, and reshaping the global technology landscape. These modern trade wars share the same DNA as their predecessors. They begin with the desire to protect national industries, but escalate into cycles of retaliation that often harm both sides. Yet, the consequences are now more far-reaching than ever. In a world where supply chains span continents, a tariff on one product in one nation can ripple across dozens of industries globally. A restriction on semiconductor exports affects smartphones, automobiles, medical equipment, and national defense systems. A tariff on steel affects construction, manufacturing, and infrastructure development worldwide. Trade wars no longer impact just traders and governments. They impact consumers, workers, and entire technological ecosystems. Looking back across history, certain patterns become unmistakably clear. First, trade wars almost always begin with the belief that economic protection will strengthen a nation's position. Second, retaliation is almost inevitable, as nations refuse to accept disadvantage. Third, prolonged trade conflict tends to weaken the global economy and damage all involved parties. Fourth, the aftermath of trade wars often forces countries to seek new agreements, treaties, and frameworks, suggesting that cooperation, though sometimes resisted, remains the long-term path to stability. From ancient grain routes to medieval maritime monopolies, from colonial mercantilism to modern technological rivalries, trade wars have shaped the world in profound ways. They have redrawn borders, toppled governments, triggered wars, and reshaped economies. They reflect the eternal tension between competition and cooperation, a tension that defines international relations even today. And as history shows, nations that engage in trade wars rarely emerge unscathed, but those that find ways to balance ambition with collaboration often achieve greater prosperity. As the world transitioned deeper into the 21st century, the dynamics of global trade wars shifted from merely physical goods to the far more complex realm of data, digital infrastructure, and technological dominance. The battlefield expanded from ports, factories, and marketplaces into cloud networks, semiconductor fabrication plants, digital payment systems, and the invisible architecture of global communication. Now trade wars were no longer just about who could make steel at a lower price or who dominated shipping lanes. They were about who controlled the future itself. History had already shown that trade wars often emerged when one power perceived another rising too quickly, and now that pattern had reappeared with striking clarity. Technology became the new oil, data the new gold, chips the new steel, and algorithms the new naval fleets. And just as ancient empires once fought for spices and sea routes, nations were now fighting to dominate artificial intelligence, 5G networks, quantum computing, and battery supply chains. But to see how these modern confrontations fit into the larger historical arc of trade wars, one must recognize that the core motivations have never changed. Nations still fear dependence, still resist vulnerability, still want control over the industries that define their power. What has changed is the scale and speed. In the past, trade wars could gradually intensify over decades. Now they can erupt in days. A new tariff can be imposed overnight. A semiconductor export restriction can cripple an entire industry within weeks. A digital blockade can isolate a nation instantly. The very interconnectedness that made globalization possible also makes trade wars far more disruptive, because every link in a supply chain is now a potential point of vulnerability. Looking back to the earlier 20th century, one sees a decisive moment when nations first realized that technological advantage, not simply raw materials, would shape the outcomes of trade conflicts. During World War II, industrial capacity and the ability to produce advanced machinery became critical. But after the war, as recovery began and the world economy rebuilt, the seeds of modern trade tensions were already being planted. Japan's transformation from a war-torn nation to an economic powerhouse occurred with astonishing speed. Fueled by disciplined industrial policy, export-driven manufacturing, and rapid technological catch-up, Japan soon became one of the world's leading producers of automobiles, electronics, and precision machinery. Looking back to the earlier 20th century, one sees a decisive moment when nations first realized that technological advantage, not simply raw materials, would shape the outcomes of trade conflicts. During World War II, industrial capacity and the ability to produce advanced machinery became critical. But after the war, as recovery began and the world economy rebuilt, the seeds of modern trade tensions were already being planted. Japan's transformation from a war-torn nation to an economic powerhouse occurred with astonishing speed. Fueled by disciplined industrial policy, export-driven manufacturing, and rapid technological catch-up, Japan soon became one of the world's leading producers of automobiles, electronics, and precision machinery. For many Western nations, especially the United States, Japan's rise felt alarmingly similar to how Britain once viewed Germany's rise before World War I. Not simply as competition, but as an existential challenge. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the U.S. Japan trade frictions erupted into a series of confrontations that bore all the hallmarks of a modern trade war. American automakers claimed they were being overwhelmed by Japanese imports, and policymakers feared the erosion of domestic manufacturing. Congress debated harsh tariffs, and the two nations entered negotiations that led Japan to adopt voluntary export restraints, a form of self-imposed limit to avoid harsher retaliation. Japan also agreed to restrictions in the semiconductor industry, where accusations of dumping and unfair pricing triggered long-running disputes. Although this did not escalate into a full-scale trade war, the underlying fear of losing industrial dominance set a precedent that would echo decades later in the U.S.-China conflict. Yet even while Japan was rising, a far larger shift was quietly underway in another part of the world. China, emerging from decades of internal upheaval, began opening its economy in the late 1970s. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, China started to integrate itself into global markets, inviting foreign investment, developing industrial zones, and building manufacturing capacity at an astonishing pace. As the years progressed, China became the world's factory, then the world's logistics backbone, and eventually the world's most formidable economic competitor. By the time China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, the global economy entered a new era, one where supply chains stretched across continents and where China became indispensable to virtually every major industry. But interdependence did not eliminate competition, it merely delayed it. For years, many Western nations welcomed China's growing role in global trade. Lower prices benefited consumers, corporate profits soared, and industries expanded into China's vast labor pool. But beneath the prosperity, strategic tensions brewed. Accusations of intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, state subsidies, and chronic trade imbalances created mounting pressure. By the late 2010s, these tensions transformed into a full-scale trade war. Tariffs targeting hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods created ripple effects across the global economy. Manufacturers scrambled to relocate supply chains. Commodity markets fluctuated wildly, and consumers felt the effects as prices rose. The U.S. China trade war became the most significant economic conflict of the modern age, not only because of its scale, but because of its implications. It represented a clash between the world's two largest economies, each seeking to secure technological dominance, protect domestic industries, and redefine the rules of global trade. It also signaled a shift away from the era of optimism that once defined globalization. Nations began questioning the benefits of deep economic integration, fearing vulnerabilities exposed by dependence on foreign supply chains. This shift echoed many past trade wars, where economic fears, rather than economic facts, triggered aggressive policies. A fascinating aspect of trade conflicts throughout history is how they often reveal deeper anxieties within nations. Trade wars are rarely about the products themselves. They are about identity, security, and the desire for control. When Britain imposed the Corn Laws in the early 19th century, it was not simply attempting to protect domestic agriculture. It was responding to fears about social instability. When the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, it was reacting to political pressure from millions of struggling workers and farmers. When China sought to dominate industries through state-led investment, it was motivated by a desire to avoid historical vulnerabilities. When the United States imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum in the late 2010s, it was not just about metal. It was about preserving strategic strength. These patterns repeat across every era. Nations act aggressively not because they're strong, but because they fear becoming weak. Trade wars are the economic expression of insecurity. Yet despite the destructive nature of trade wars, they have also triggered innovation, reform, and strategic breakthroughs. The Navigation Acts, though destructive, helped push England to build a formidable navy and modernize its economy. The trade tensions with Japan pushed American industries to adapt, automate, and improve quality standards, which eventually revitalized sectors that were once considered lost. The U.S. China trade war forced supply chains to diversify, reducing global vulnerability to disruptions. In this sense, trade wars are paradoxical. They inflict damage, yet they also catalyze transformation. But even as they transform industries, they also reshape political landscapes. One of the most striking examples is how the long-standing trade rivalry between Britain and the Netherlands in the 17th century eventually contributed to a shift in global power. The Dutch, despite their economic brilliance, could not maintain dominance when confronted with English restrictions and the rise of larger imperial competitors. Their decline opened the door for England to establish one of the largest empires in history. Similarly, the industrial trade conflicts of the 19th century helped elevate Germany and the United States to global prominence. These transformations remind us that trade wars often produce winners and losers not through immediate victory, but through long-term structural shifts. As globalization evolved, new forms of trade conflict emerged beyond tariffs and embargoes. Currency manipulation became a significant battleground. During the 1980s, accusations that Japan artificially weakened the yen to boost exports triggered intense political backlash, leading to the Plaza Accord, a coordinated intervention by major economies to realign exchange rates. This event showcased a new truth. In a financialized world, currency policies could function as a weapon of trade, affecting everything from export competitiveness to national debt levels. As the story of global trade wars deepens, one begins to notice that every major economic conflict exists not in isolation, but as part of a larger tapestry of shifting ambitions, emerging powers, and the perpetual struggle for influence. The world often imagines trade as a neutral, transactional exchange. Yet beneath the surface, it has always been a contest for leverage, a mechanism through which nations shape not only their prosperity, but their geopolitical destiny. This continuity becomes particularly evident when examining how trade wars intersect with technological revolutions, resource scarcity, and ideological shifts. Consider, for example, the profound impact that resource-based trade conflicts have had throughout history. In the late 19th century, access to raw materials like coal, timber, iron ore, and later petroleum became a central driver of both cooperation and confrontation. Industrializing nations depended heavily on these resources, and competition for them created new tensions. Germany's late unification and rapid industrial expansion put it in direct rivalry with established colonial powers, especially Britain and France. Access to foreign markets and raw materials became so essential that Germany embarked on an imperial strategy to compete, eventually contributing to the complex web of rivalries that erupted into World War I. Although the war is remembered for its political and ideological causes, economic competition, particularly trade and resource insecurity, played a fundamental role in pushing Europe toward catastrophe. Even during the interwar period, the scars of World War I left nations deeply distrustful of one another's economic motives. When the global economy collapsed in the 1930s, governments panicked and turned inward, raising barriers to protect domestic industries at the exact moment when international cooperation was needed most. The result was a devastating cycle where each nation's attempt to guard itself worsened the global downturn, fueling extremism, nationalism, and ultimately war. This period not only highlighted how trade wars can intensify economic depression, but revealed the political extremism that often follows economic isolationism. When people lose jobs, inflation rises, businesses collapse, and international markets shut down, they become vulnerable to leaders who promise strength through nationalism and protectionism. Thus, trade wars have always carried political consequences far greater than any tariff percentage might suggest. As the post-World War II era began, the world sought to avoid repeating these mistakes by creating the Bretton Woods system, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, institutions designed to stabilize financial systems, encourage cooperation, and prevent the kinds of aggressive protectionism that destroyed the global economy in the 1930s. The formation of GATT was a milestone in reducing trade barriers, setting rules, and resolving disputes before they escalated. For decades, trade wars became less common, or at least less destructive, because nations understood the enormous costs they posed. Yet even during this period of relative stability, there were hidden trade battles brewing beneath the surface. The Cold War created two separate economic spheres: the capitalist world centered around the United States, and the socialist bloc led by the Soviet Union. Though the Cold War is often framed as a military and ideological competition, it was equally an economic struggle. The Soviet Union attempted to build a self-sufficient economic system insulated from Western trade, while the United States cultivated alliances through economic assistance, open markets, and global financial leadership. This economic divide gave rise to competition over technologies, industrial influence, and access to strategic regions. However, because the Soviet system was largely closed and autarkic, it did not participate in traditional trade wars. Instead, it experienced the internal consequences of economic isolation: inefficiency, stagnation, shortages, and a lack of innovation. In many ways, the Soviet collapse was the ultimate demonstration of how refusing to integrate into the global economy can become a self-imposed economic war, one where a nation battles its own system rather than external rivals. Meanwhile, the Western world entered a new phase of globalization, driven by rapid technological advances, reduced trade barriers, and the belief that economic interdependence would promote peace. But as globalization accelerated, it also created imbalances and vulnerabilities that would later fuel new forms of trade warfare. One of the most pivotal moments in modern economic history came during the 1973 oil crisis, when OPEC countries coordinated an embargo that sent global energy prices skyrocketing. Although this was not a traditional trade war in the sense of tariff retaliation, it functioned as a strategic economic weapon. By restricting supply, oil-producing nations used their control over a critical resource to influence geopolitical behavior. The shockwave it created was extraordinary. Inflation soared, industries stalled, unemployment rose, and entire economies reeled from the sudden increase in energy costs. This crisis revealed something profoundly important: That control over a crucial resource could give one group of nations tremendous leverage over others. After this incident, countries began considering energy security as a central national strategy, diversifying energy sources and stockpiling reserves to avoid future vulnerability. The oil crisis was a reminder that trade warfare can take many forms, and that embargoes and resource manipulation can produce consequences as far-reaching as any tariff war. As globalization continued into the 1980s and 1990s, supply chains became more complex, spanning continents and connecting nations in ways previously unimaginable. A product manufactured in one country might contain components sourced from 10 others, assembled in yet another, and sold worldwide. While this interconnectedness created prosperity and efficiency, it also created fragility. Any disruption, whether caused by tariffs, sanctions, political conflict, or natural disasters, could ripple across the entire system. These fragilities became glaringly visible in the early 21st century, especially during major trade disputes. When the United States imposed steel tariffs in the early 2000s, it triggered immediate retaliation from Europe and Japan, threatening billions in exports. More importantly, it hurt American industries that relied on imported steel, demonstrating a recurring truth. Trade wars often backfire on the country that starts them, because modern economies are far too interconnected for isolationist measures to produce simple benefits. As the long arc of global trade wars comes into view, stretching from the ancient rivalries of merchant empires to the modern clashes of superpowers, one truth emerges with unmistakable clarity. Every trade war, regardless of era, reveals the deepest anxieties of the nations involved, because trade is not just an exchange of goods. It is an exchange of power, identity, and control. The conflicts of the past show that nations rarely lash out economically from a place of confidence. They do so when they sense change slipping beyond their grasp, when they fear losing technological dominance, when they feel their industries weakening or their influence shrinking. In this sense, trade wars are not merely economic events, but psychological ones, fueled by insecurity masquerading as strength. And as time marches forward, each generation inherits the unfinished consequences of these conflicts, shaped by decisions made decades or even centuries earlier. From the mercantilist battles of Europe to the industrial showdowns of the 19th century, from the tariff races that preceded economic depressions to the technological standoffs that define the modern world, every trade war adds a new layer to a story that humanity continues to write in cycles. In each chapter, we see the same themes emerge with different faces. Rising powers challenging established ones, resource-rich nations leveraging scarcity, indebted nations resisting foreign control, technological shifts creating new vulnerabilities, and governments invoking the language of national survival, even as they inflame global tensions. And yet, despite the repetitive nature of these conflicts, the world continues to advance. Not because of trade wars, but in spite of them. When one looks at the Netherlands and Britain clashing over maritime dominance, it is easy to see the destruction. But hidden beneath the rivalry was the emergence of advanced naval engineering, financial systems, and commercial institutions. When the United States and Britain engaged in bitter tariff disputes during the 19th century, political relations strained. Yet these tensions also pushed nations to industrialize faster, innovate deeper, and diversify their production. When OPEC's embargo rattled the global energy system, it devastated economies, but it also sparked transformative investment in new technologies, from alternative energy research to more efficient engines to strategic petroleum reserves. When China curtails rare earth mineral shipments, manufacturers around the world scramble desperately to secure alternatives. When Europe develops carbon border taxes, emerging economies must redesign entire industrial strategies. Even diplomatic tensions can trigger market instability, investment withdrawal, or sudden embargoes that reshape alliances and create new geopolitical calculations. Yet for all these risks, trade wars continue because nations convince themselves that self-interest will outweigh collective harm, that short-term victories can be gained without long-term pain. But history contradicts this belief over and over again. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was meant to protect American jobs. Instead, it wiped out international markets, deepened the Great Depression, and destabilized global politics so severely that it became one of the catalysts of World War II. The colonial trade restrictions of the mercantilist era were meant to enrich empires. Instead, they fueled rebellions, revolutions, and the eventual collapse of those very empires. Even modern trade wars, launched under the banner of fairness, often produce unintended consequences. Higher costs for consumers, disrupted industries, inflationary pressures, and diplomatic strain. Nations may begin these conflicts believing they can control the outcome, but history shows that trade wars behave like wildfires, easy to ignite, difficult to contain, and impossible to direct once they spread beyond their origin. Still, amid the chaos, trade wars illuminate something essential about the human condition. They reveal that economic power is never permanent, that dominance always shifts, that no nation can remain at the center forever. They expose the illusion that borders can insulate economies from global realities, and they demonstrate that prosperity is dependent not on isolation, but on cooperation, innovation, and resilience. The countries that ultimately rise from trade wars are not those that cling to old models, nor those that try to wall themselves off from competition, but those that adapt, reinvent, and rethink their place in the world. Britain survived its maritime conflicts by embracing industrialization. Japan endured its 1980s struggles by investing in advanced technologies. The United States weathered its 20th century trade battles through innovation, productivity, and diversification. And China, facing unprecedented trade pressure, is now reshaping its economy to compete in the industries of the future. So when we ask how previous global trade wars played out, the answer is not merely a sequence of conflicts, tariffs, and retaliations. It is a story of transformation. Trade wars have toppled empires, reconfigured alliances, redirected technological revolutions, collapsed economies, and reshaped global power structures. But more importantly, they have forced humanity to confront the consequences of fear-driven policy. Every time nations choose confrontation over cooperation, the world pays a price. Sometimes it is economic hardship, sometimes political instability, sometimes war. And yet, from each crisis emerges a new understanding of how fragile and interconnected the global system truly is. In the end, the greatest lesson history offers is that trade wars do not end because one nation wins. They end because the world grows tired of losing. They end because nations recognize that cooperation, however imperfect, is more sustainable than conflict. They end because economies cannot thrive in isolation. And they end because humanity, time and time again, realizes that the pursuit of dominance without regard for others leads not to prosperity, but to decline. The world will face new trade wars in the future over technology, energy, data, resources, and emerging industries we cannot yet imagine. But if history teaches us anything, it is that the only lasting victory in a trade war comes not from defeating rivals, but from building a world stable enough that such wars are no longer inevitable.